are different ways to think about Kant and his moral philosophy. I want you to, at least at the beginning, to think in terms think of Kant in terms of opposites here. I don't normally like doing it this way, but I think it helps to capture what Kant is thinking about and sort of how he's framing his thoughts here. And there's a couple of concepts that are involved in thinking about Kant, and some funny words and so on. So let's look at a couple of these in terms of opposites. Again, this is trying to prime you a little bit to get at sort of how Kant is thinking about things. I find it helps. One of these concepts are the a priori and the a posteriori. These are just sort of fancy Latin terms that refer to experience. The a priori is knowledge that comes to us without experience, meaning knowledge that we can have just about thinking about things without actually having to experience the world. This is, in other words, conceptual knowledge. Then there's a posteriori knowledge that is gained from experience of the world. And we'll say a little bit more about this later, I suppose. But for Kant, morality is an a priori matter. It is not an a posteriori matter. Morality is about concepts and reasoning. It is not about what happens in the world. And this is sort of what he means by the a priori and the a posteriori. He thinks in terms of reason versus irrationality. This comes up a lot. If morality is an a priori matter, it must be a matter of reason and reason alone. And in fact, that's how we define the a priori, through reason and reason alone. As opposed to being irrational. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean what is a posteriori is irrational in a pejorative sense. But for instance, your emotions, your experiences are not a product, according to Kant anyway, of rationality, of deliberate reflection. Experience is something that happens to us. It's passive. Whereas reason for Kant is direct and is intentional. So he thinks in terms of reason versus irrationality here. He also talks about duty, and I'll get to some of this in more detail. Duty versus insubordination. He doesn't use that word, but the opposite, if you will, of duty would be insubordination or lawlessness. This is huge for Kant, as we're going to find out here in a little while. Only a reasonable or rational person, a being who is rational, can be dutiful, where duty is the ability to obey the law for the sake of obeying the law. And by law here, we don't mean simply like our legal codes. We mean moral law. In fact, the moral law. We'll get to that again in a little while. But to be dutiful is to respect laws, rules. And to be insubordinate is to not respect laws and rules. So this plays a big part, as we'll see in his thinking as well. So morality derives its moral worth internally. For Kant, moral laws, moral rules, moral judgments are worthy simply in themselves. They're not, or they don't derive their worth from consequences of the world. It's not what an action results in that determines whether an action is right or wrong. It's the concept of the action that is going to determine whether that action is right or wrong. And that's a rational process. Another concept, as a matter of fact, what he starts out with is this notion of a good will and a bad will. The will is um, the guiding of an action. It's how actions are performed. And of course, if a will is good, if a will does or commands good actions, morally worthy actions, then the will is good, and the opposite for a bad will. And so all of this is tied up in his notion of freedom, what he calls autonomy, and the opposite of autonomy is heteronomy. So one is free, one is autonomous, and if one is, as the word indicates, auto and nomos from the Greek, meaning self-governing, then one is free. If one is able to legislate oneself, if one is able to act in a law-like manner through one's own actions and willing, then one is free. Otherwise, one is governed by, one is ruled by something different, something other than oneself. And this is what he means by heteronomous. So you're autonomous. To be autonomous is to be free, is to be self-governing. To be heteronomous is to be governed by something else. So these are just some initial sort of opposites here. What Kant would call an antinomy. You don't have to worry about that here in this class. But he thinks in terms of opposites here. All right. Let's try to understand Kant in terms of concepts. So Kant's frame of mind is one of duality here. He's trying to pit one type of thing against another and show that one is morally worthy, and another isn't. But in order to do this, he relies on concepts. So let's look at some of those concepts here. First, he talks about the will, and these page numbers refer to the pages of in the document that you have. So, for example, chapter 1, moving from common sense knowledge to philosophical knowledge about morality. You'll notice that that's page 5 of the whole sort of published document. It's page 1 of the PDF version that you have, I believe. But it's page 5. So when you look on it and you see chapter 1, you'll see the page 5 below it. That's what that page 5 through 6 refers to. So he starts off by saying nothing in the world, or even out of it, so nothing can possibly be conceived that could be called good without qualification except a good will. Here he say that the will is the only thing that is intrinsically worthy. The will is the only thing that whose value comes from itself, from being the thing that it is. Now, things might make it bad, and things can help in it being good, but by itself, Kant says that the will is the only thing that is good in and of itself. It's not good for anything, meaning its consequences. It is just good. He says, like a diamond, it would shine, regardless of what's around it. Now, of course, the will can be corrupt, or I should say be corrupted. And this is where reason comes in. It is the use of reason, right, that makes a will good. So he says on page 5 here, what makes a good will good? He said it isn't what it brings about. Its usefulness in achieving some intended end. In other words, it's not its consequences. Rather, goodwill is good because of how it wills. It is good in itself. And how it wills, for Kant, should be according to reason. So the will uses reason. It is the will's use of reason, of abiding by logical principles, meaning the principle of non-contradiction. It is the will's use of reason to not be contradictory that makes the will good. Which brings us to reason. And, he makes a point of saying that, so reason could make us happy in a sense, but he goes on page 6 to remind us that reason can also make us unhappy. And his point here is that reason isn't directed toward happiness. The purpose of reason isn't to make us happy. Although it might assist in it. Again, it can assist in our unhappiness as well. So we can't think of reason as having that type of goal. That's not the goal of reason. Nor will reason satisfy all of our needs. Reason won't, sort of satisfy everything. For example, let's say being happy, for example. Being happy requires, friendship. It requires being loved, among other things. Not just by family, but friends and so on. And reason doesn't necessarily bring that to you. Someone can be completely rational and still be a jerk and not have any friends, even though they're completely rational. Now, certainly, reason has its advantages. It can help us do things. It can help us be witty. It can, in some cases, maybe help us get friends. It can certainly help us solve problems. But you can't rely on reason, he's saying, in order to meet all of our needs like happiness and so on. In fact, he says the supreme condition, the purpose of reason, is to have an influence over the will, to produce a will that is good in itself and not as a means to some desirable consequence. So for him, reason has its advantages for this or for that. It also has its disadvantages for this or that. But what we need to realize is that the purpose of reason is to govern the will. And here's that law-like nature that we were talking about. That dichotomy, the antinomy that we started out with. He's thinking about governing. He's thinking about law. Again, not legal codes, not that kind of law, but more like universal laws. His comparison is natural laws. And this is the point of reason. It is the job of reason to understand laws and to govern the will, to make sure that the will obeys laws. All right. Continuing here, another concept here is duty. And the concept of duty for Kant contains the concept of a good will. In other words, you can't talk about duty unless you also talk about a good will. And a good will, as we know, is a will that is governed by reason. Where reason, someone or something is reasonable if they abide by the principle of non-contradiction. Someone is reasonable if they purposefully try to avoid contradictory concepts. This is on a handout that is posted. But in other words, to be a little more clear, a concept is contradictory if it asserts and denies the same thing at the same time. A square circle, for example, is a contradictory concept. If by circle we mean either not having any sides or, mathematically speaking, having an infinite number of sides, then to specify a square circle where square means four sides, it's impossible to have a four-sided object with no sides or a four-sided object with infinite number of sides. Those two concepts cannot be reconciled, and that's what we mean by a contradiction. Contradiction isn't just something confusing, it's something unintelligible. It is literally nonsense. It's something that can't be. You can't even conceive of a four-sided, non-sided object. You can think of a circle inside a square inside a circle, but you can't think of a single object that simultaneously has four sides and no sides. And so a rational being is going to be a being that will purposely avoid contradictions, and it is this concept of reason that is involved in a good will. It is only a rational person, right? Or I should say, it is the job of reason to govern the will to act in a way that is non-contradictory. And acting in that way is what Kant means by duty. Duty is something that actually restricts the will to make it good. Duty is the concept that shows the path that reason should take. By acting out of duty, one is acting freely, as opposed to other reasons. Say, one's emotions, one's very strong feelings towards something, one's, sense of justice even. So I might act to save a child from a burning building, for example. And you might say that would be a good thing. But if you find out that the reason I saved a child from a burning building is because either I wanted the glory that comes from it, or if it was just an unthinking act that I just rushed into the building blindly out of a sense of danger for the child, then for Kant, this doesn't count as a morally good act. I wasn't acting out of duty. I wasn't acting out of respect for the moral law, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But rather, I was acting for some other reason. In other words, I wasn't acting rationally. And this is a violation for Kant. But I'll get to that in a second. Then we have commands, what we call imperatives, versus desires. An imperative is a command. If I say, go get me a beer, that's an imperative in grammar. It's a command. And for Kant, there's a difference between acting out of obligation, out of duty, and acting out of our desires. To follow a command, to follow an imperative, is to follow a principle, is to act on principle. Whereas if I act out of my desires, say like my desire for the honor of rescuing a child, then I'm not acting rationally. I'm not acting in a way that abides by the principle of non-contradiction. I'm acting because I want something. And again, this is a violation for Kant. We're going against duty, against the notion of following a law for the sake of following a law, for being rational. And then finally, we have this concept of law for Kant. And this is kind of an overarching principle. Kant thinks that when we act, we're acting in a law-like manner. We're following laws that we set for ourselves. When you run out of milk and you go to the store to buy more milk, Kant thinks that you're acting on a principle, a maxim, a law. And that law might be something like, when I run out of milk, I should go to the store to buy some if I want more. And for Kant, this is a law. It is a rule, and as such, only a rational person can follow it. Now, laws, and to follow a law requires reason. It's a deliberate thing. So your dog, according to Kant, might act in a regular consistent behavior. But for Kant, the dog isn't rational in the sense that it can contemplate its concepts and act on the sake of the law, act on a law for the sake of it being a law. For example, when you tell a dog to sit and it sits, it'll do that regularly because you've trained it. It is doubtful that the dog is sitting because it's reflecting on its own ability to follow the law. Whereas, for example, let's say you're driving at 3 a.m. and you come across a stop sign. Now, you're not drunk or high or anything, you're perfectly sober. There's no cops around, and let's say you know that there aren't any cops around. Everyone's asleep. You're not going to run over or hit anything. Nothing's around you. You will not get in trouble if you run the stop sign. Nevertheless, you as a rational being can follow the law for the sake of following the law. And so you'll stop at that stop sign. Or at least I hope you do. And this is what Kant means here, right? It is a rational being that can respect the law for the sake of respecting the law. Now, we'll understand this a little bit deeper here in a little bit. But for Kant, only a rational being can do that. And so your dog might follow regular principles, or at least on the outside. To us, it might seem that way. But for Kant, it's just a matter of habit. It is the dog acting out of desire. It's either been conditioned to behave that way. In other words, it's a non-thinking behavior, or the dog is expecting some sort of reward, whether it's a treat or a pat on the head or saying good dog or something. And that's not reasonable for Kant. And so what Kant is playing on here is this notion of laws guiding actions. And we'll understand this a little bit deeper here in a little bit with this principle of universalizability. But please refer to the handout as well. All right. Let's get into more directly his philosophy of morality. And he posits 3 propositions. 1, he says an action must be done from duty in order to have any moral worth. Already kind of covered this. But the idea here is that we don't control our desires. If I just read this for a second. We might control what we do. So we have a desire. You don't control having the desire. You might control how you behave having that desire. But you don't control having the desire. So when we do act on our desire, you're not acting freely. It's when you act in light of reason, regardless of the desire, that you're acting freely. Otherwise, you're just a slave to your emotions. An action not done out of respect for the law has no moral worth. So you might save the child, which arguably is a good thing, but if you're saving the child because it was an emotional reaction, then for Kant, that's not a free act. You are being compelled to act that way. Your emotions or your feelings or social pressure was compelling you, was forcing you to act that way. Whereas, had you decided to save the child out of a sense of duty, and again, I'm gonna come to this here in a second about how that relates to the moral law. But if you act out of respect for the moral law, then that action is morally worthy. This will make sense here in a second. Keep that in mind. 2, an action done from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose, not in the consequence that is to be attained from it, but in the maxim, in the rule that to which the action is determined. So it's not the consequence. So saving the child isn't good because the child was saved. It's going to be good because of the rule that you are following for rescuing the child. In other words, is the rule that you were following, like we talked about earlier, is the rule that you're following contradictory or is it consistent? That's what's going to determine whether or not an action is moral. The maxim is what Kant talks about when he talks about the maxim. The maxim is a principle. It is a rule that the will follows. An action's moral worth has nothing to do with the outcome, but whether or not the maxim, the rule that one follows, is conceptually consistent. Finally, then, duty, properly defined, is the necessity of an action done out of respect for the law. And remember, reason is what governs the will. Reason is the avoidance of non-contradiction in our conceptual matters, and duty is going to respect that. So one acts dutifully if one respects the laws, whether it's a rational law, a law of nature, or in this case, a law of morality. So if we are to avoid desires in our actions, then the only thing left to follow is law. Again, we're not talking about civil laws here, but just law in general, and only a rational person can do that. Which brings us then to the categorical imperative. And this is the supreme condition, is what Kant talks about. And he formulates it as such. He says, typo here, I ought, O-U-G-H-T. I ought never to act in such a way that I couldn't also will that the maxim on which I act should be a universal law. In other words, there's two formulations here. The positive, act only on a maxim that can be universalized. Do not act on a maxim that cannot be universalized, to put it negatively. And so this is the law. The categorical imperative says act only on a maxim that can be universalized. That is the singular and only moral law that governs all of the other moral laws and decisions and behavior. If something violates, if a concept violates the categorical imperative, then the action is immoral. So let's try to understand what that means a little bit. So here is what I call Kant's formula for the moral worth of an action. Now, he doesn't lay it out like I'm going to lay it out here, but I think if you read carefully, then you'll see where I'm getting this from. So the first step is to discover the personal maxim of the action. Take any action whatsoever and ask yourself, what is the rule that I am following when I do this? And then formulate it. I should do X when Y, and fill it in. So find your personal maxim. Discover your personal maxim of the action. Now, you're special, but you're not that special. You're not so special that a rule applies only to you. And this is, again, part of Kant's concept of law and universalizability. For a law to be worth anything, it must be universal. Otherwise, you just have a world full of exceptions, and moral worth would be meaningless. Just like the law of gravity would be meaningless if it only applied to this or that thing, it has, in order for it to be meaningful, it has to apply universally. The same thing for him applies for morality. And so, once you discover your personal maxim, you need to translate that personal maxim into a universal form. The I turns into we. We'll give an example here in a little while. So once you discover that universal maxim, then you need to discover the concept of the action. What makes that action that action? How do we define that action intellectually? And once you've defined that concept, then you ask yourself, is there a contradiction between 2 and 3? Does the universal concept contradict the concept of the action? And if we answer yes, then the action is immoral because it's unreasonable. And if we answer no, then the action is moral because it is reasonable. So let's give an example here. Let's take lying. So let's say you lie. Kant asks us to ask what your personal maxim is. And this could be many things, and this is part of the criticism of Kant, but we'll get to that later maybe. So if I lie for this or that reason, Kant wants us to formulate the maxim that governs why it is that I lie. So for the sake of convenience here, let's say that the rule that I follow when I lie is I should lie when it's convenient for me to do so. Because that's covers most of the instances in which I might lie. I lie when it's convenient. And so that's the rule that I'm following. That is a law that I'm following for myself. But since laws must be applied universally, it must apply to other people as well. I'm special, but I'm not that special. And if I consider myself a reasonable being, then this law must apply universally. And so, the personal maxim, I should lie when it's convenient for me to do so, becomes we should lie when it's convenient for us to do so. Again, I'm special, but I'm not that special. If something applies to me, then it should apply to other people. The next thing I need to do then is ask, what does it mean to lie? Well, to lie, if you're going to lie, at the very least, it also means that you must have some respect for the truth. You can't lie if you don't think you know what is true. First of all. Second of all, lying involves getting other people to believe something to be true that you think is false. Which also, again, means that you think you know the difference between truth and falsity. But you're trying to get someone to believe something is true that you believe is false. In other words, lying depends on the ability to tell the truth. If you can't tell the difference between truth and falsity, then you can't lie, because you can't conceal the truth in order to get someone to believe something that's false. Right? So at least a bare minimum, this is part of the concept of what it means to lie. Lying depends on truth-telling. It depends on you being able to tell what's true and what's false, and getting other people to believe what's true, what you think is false. Then we ask, is there a contradiction between the universal maxim, remember, we should lie when it's convenient for us to do so, is there a contradiction between that and the concept of lying? Knowing what's true or false in an attempt to getting people to believe what's true, even though it's false. And if we consider for a moment, imagine a hypothetical case. So this is 2 here. Discover the universal maxim. Imagine a hypothetical case where everyone were acting on the universal maxim of lying. Lying, the universal maxim says everyone, we, should lie when it's convenient for us to do so. In that world, it is conceivable that at any given point, everyone is not telling the truth. But if you have a case where it's conceivable that everyone is lying, then how could anyone determine what's actually true? In the real world here, we might determine part of how we determine what's true is we say rely on people like scientists, for example. Just as one example. I rely on what the physicists say about gravity. But if it's conceivable that our physicists are lying to us about what gravity is, or our doctors are lying to us about what a disease is and so on, or if our politicians are lying to us about any given concept, if it's conceivable that everybody is lying, then you can't ever pin down what's actually true conceptually. And so in that world, to lie doesn't make any sense because you can't pin down what's true. So conceptually speaking, you can't simultaneously universalize the maxim of lying and have the concept of lying mean what it means. In a world where everyone is conceivably lying, the concept of lying breaks down. Lying can't mean what it means. And so this is a contradiction for Kant. And so for 4 here, there's a contradiction between 2 and 3. And so the act of lying is immoral because it's not reasonable, because you can't act on a contradictory maxim. So lying is wrong because it's unreasonable, not because of the concept that is involved. I'm sorry, not because of the consequence of the action, but because the concept is not universalizable. It's a really interesting point. So let's look at this in terms of a diagram, because I know this helps. This helps me anyway. So we start off with the goodwill. And the antonym to the goodwill is the bad will. So we think in terms of opposites here. A good will is a will that is free. The antonym, the opposite of freedom, is heteronomy. So a good will is autonomous. A good will is free. A bad will is not free. A bad will is governed by something other than reason. Freedom requires rationality. Only a reasonable, rational being can be free. Irrationality is the mark of heteronomy. A being that is irrational is a being that is not free, that is going to be governed by something other than rationality. That might be emotions, that might be being compelled by social forces and so on, but not rationality. A rational being is dutiful. A rational being can respect the law for the sake of respecting the law. A being that is insubordinate is a being that does not respect the law for the sake of respecting the law. And so a dutiful being is a being that can abide by the categorical imperative. The moral law, the singular and only moral law that governs all other moral laws. It is what defines morality. And so a being that can abide by the categorical imperative is a dutiful being, and a dutiful being is one that has a good will. So then in the opposite direction, a bad will is a will that is insubordinate, and so cannot follow duty, cannot be dutiful, and therefore cannot abide by the categorical imperative. An insubordinate will is a will that is irrational. An irrational will or being is one that is heteronomous, that is governed by something other than reason. And so a heteronomous being is a being that is acting on a bad will, is a being whose actions are not governed by reason and the principle of non-contradiction. And so this, in a sort of nutshell, and what you're looking at now, is kind of a diagram of what Kant's moral philosophy or a moral being looks like. Morality is not a matter of consequence of the world for Kant. It is a matter of concepts and whether or not a concept is contradictory. If somebody acts on a concept that is contradictory, then one is being irrational and therefore the action is immoral. Okay, please look at the handout that I provided in conjunction with the other readings for some guidance on Kant here. Hope this helps